and it's true. Normally we have 3 downstairs and 1 upstairs, and today we have 3 upstairs and 1 downstairs. And so hopefully Brendan is behaving himself, and you can all keep an eye on and then tell me later whether it happened. It's just like real church. Uh, so I'm so glad whether you're joining us right now or whether you're tuning in later on YouTube. I'm glad you're here. And wherever it is that you're tuning in from, whether that's your PJs on your couch or whether you're with other people watching this later, we're glad that you're here. So a couple things just to keep you up to date on in the life of our church. Again, our giving. We just had our update for the last pastoral team meeting, and our giving and our spending are pretty much equal, which is great. However, our spending has also been lower than anticipated, and we've been very careful in our spending. So some of our budgeted things we haven't done, or we've made choices to do some less things. So just a reminder to continue giving. If you need help getting things set up, call Carolyn and she can help you in the office. Secondly, yesterday we did a bit of a blitz of a fall clean, and there were folks cleaning inside and outside. We got a whole bunch of things done. There's Ed and Gordon looking happy about finding garbage. The Bowdlers were all over the upstairs windows there in those classrooms, which was great. And Kwok family, thanks for helping with the weeding. I told Alana that she now can put landscaping on her resume. So thanks for all of that. And the only person I didn't get a picture of from the time I was there was Martin. He was off busy working. And then I know some others of you showed up later in the day. So thank you to everybody who did your part. And we got the places looking spick and span. And that's great. And got to some of the details that are harder to get to. The next thing is just a reminder that if you still think of yourself as new-ish to this community, and there's a generous definition of that, in fact, you can kind of decide if you're still new, we'd really like to have a chance for me to meet with you, hopefully in some groupings, so we can offer an in-person or a virtual or both, depending on how much interest there is, but we just need to know who's interested in such a thing. So if you're one of those people, please feel free to call or email the church office and let us know so that we can get those gatherings planned in the next couple of weeks. And I look forward to doing that. Also, small groups, there are some things just in the works, kind of being figured out. So if you are interested in something like that, stay tuned and maybe even let me know that that's something you're really interested in. There are a couple of in-person options that will probably take place at the church because we have space there to keep proper distance, which is harder to do in our homes. And then also there probably will be at least one virtual option, if not a couple. And so if you're feeling like you need to stay home and do things using computers, we can do that too. So there'll be more coming out in the next week, but I just wanted to make sure you knew that that's happening. And then the other thing we're going to start doing in October is the drop-in. And obviously there are people who drop in actually all throughout the week, right, Carolyn? But in this way, we wanted to actually designate a time where the building is open. We'll have chairs set up at appropriate distances, and you could come in and either plan to meet a friend there and then see who else shows up, or you could just come because you're ready to connect and reconnect with some people that you haven't seen. So I will not always be there for the whole 2 hours, but I'll try to be there for at least part of it so I can say hello to whoever comes in as well. So it's just a chance. And it's also a reminder for you that if you do have a group that has been meeting in the park all summer and now suddenly as the weather starts to change, you're trying to sort it out, we do have space and we would love to make it available to you so that you can meet safely as the weather changes. And so this is one way to do that, but there's lots of other ways too. So do ask if you need a space to do those things. And I think that's it for announcements this morning. So lots of things going on. I know many of you are still making your adjustments to your fall routine. It's not quite looking the way fall always does. But I hope too that many of you have been praying the Psalms along with many of us in the community. And I know this week we prayed a couple of Psalms that are quite familiar, including Psalm 23. And there's a reason that this is such a beloved psalm, and it's because it actually expresses so much of what we experience as humans. So I thought this morning we would use Psalm 23 as our call to worship, but we'll do it a little differently than maybe you've done it before. I'm going to teach you this short refrain, and then we'll sing it, and then hear Emily read bits of the psalm in between, and then we'll take a moment to sing this in between her readings. So this is how it sounds.
Shepherd me, O God, beyond my wants, beyond my fears, from death into life.
Let's try it one more time.
Shepherd me, O God, beyond my wants, beyond my fears, from death into life.
The Lord is my shepherd. He gives me everything I need. He lets me lie down in fields of green grass. He leads me beside quiet waters. He gives me new strength. He guides me in the right paths for the honor of his name.
Shepherd me, O God, beyond my wants, beyond my fears, from death into life.
Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will not be afraid. You are with me. Your shepherd's rod and staff comfort me.
Shepherd me, O God, beyond my wants, beyond my fears, from death into life.
You prepare a feast for me, right in front of my enemies. You pour oil on my head, my cup runs over. I am sure that your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will live in the house of the Lord forever.
Shepherd me, O God, beyond my wants, beyond my fears, from death into life. Shepherd me, O God, beyond my wants, beyond my fears, from death into life. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing to you, pleasing to you. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing to you, my God. You're my rock and my redeemer. You're the reason that I sing. I desire to be a blessing in your eyes. Every hour, every moment, Lord, I want to be your servant. I desire to be a blessing in your eyes. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing to you, pleasing to you. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing to you, my God. You're my rock and my redeemer. You're the reason that I sing. I desire to be a blessing in your eyes. Every hour, every moment, Lord, I want to be your servant. I desire to be a blessing in your eyes. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing to you, my God.
Thanks. Well, whoops. I'll stop hitting the microphone now. If you are familiar with the Psalms that we read this week, you'll recognize both of those then, because that was Psalm 23, and then the words for that song that we just sang come from Psalm 19. And it's often in sort of higher church traditions, that's actually what the preacher often says before they preach. They'll say, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts, they often say, be pleasing to God in this time. And so, goodness, yes, may that be so. Today's sermon is called Family Dynamics, because we're in Genesis. And Genesis is all about a very, very human family, multiple generations of that family. So do you remember last week, the big promise? God directed Abram's attention to the sky and said, I'm going to give you descendants as numerous as all those stars. This is a promise he's making to an old, childless man. It's kind of a ridiculous promise in some ways. Promises Abram a legacy of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, more than he will be able to keep track of. What about the week before? Do you remember? See, of course, the answer is yes, of course, Andrea, we remember. Do you remember the week before when we looked at the very beginning of Genesis, at our own origin story? Humans placed within God's good creation to reflect the image of their creator. And then, of course, the story of rebellion. Well, this week we jumped to the end of the book of Genesis. We started in Genesis 2, actually, not Genesis 1, but we referred to Genesis 1. And then we caught up last week with Abram in Genesis 15. But today, in the narrative lectionary, we're meant to read from Genesis 37 and 50, the beginning and the end of the Joseph story. Which means we skip over the story of the arrival of Abraham's two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. We skip over Isaac and his two sons, Jacob and Esau. We skip the story of Jacob cheating Esau out of his birthright, and then Laban tricking Jacob into marrying both Leah and Rachel. And we pick up the story with Jacob as an older man and all of his children. And I was trying to figure out how best to summarize this story for you, and I found this video from the Bible Project. If you're not familiar with the Bible Project, that's something you should Google later, and maybe even I'll share the link to this in tomorrow's email. But they do a great job of giving you both a visual and words to tell the story. And so they created two videos. And if you look at the image on your screen, you'll see they've got Genesis 1 to 11 and then Genesis 12 to 50. And so in essence, the first week we looked at Genesis 2 and 3 out of that first story. Last week we did the beginning of Abraham's family, and now we trace through to the end of the stories that are told in Genesis with Genesis 37 and 50. And so we're going to watch just 3 minutes, not even 3 minutes, that summarize the Joseph story, but also give us a reminder of how it fits into the context of the book of Genesis as a whole. So instead of reading just selected verses and trying to piece the story together, here is a summary of the Joseph story.
Now, it's this last part of the book, the story of Jacob's sons, where all the themes come to a head. Jacob loves his second to youngest son, Joseph, more than any of the others, and he gives him this special jacket. And the 10 older sons come to hate Joseph, and so they kidnap him, and they plan to kill him, but instead they decide to just sell him into slavery in Egypt, where he ends up in prison. Talk about family failure. But God is with Joseph, and he orchestrates Joseph's release from prison, and Pharaoh ends up elevating Joseph to second in command over all of Egypt. And so Joseph saves the nation of Egypt during a famine. And he also ends up saving his brothers and his family from starving to death. And so once again, we can see the folly and the sin of Abraham's family is met with God's faithfulness, who subverts even the evil of the brothers into an occasion to save life. And this is actually what Joseph says right near the end of the book. He says to his brothers, "You all planned this for evil, but God planned it for good, to save many lives." Now, these words are strategically placed at the end of the book because they summarize not only the story of Joseph and his brothers, but the book as a whole. From Genesis 3 onward, humans keep acting selfishly and doing evil, but this God is not going to leave his world to its own devices. He remains faithful and determined to bless people despite their failures. You can see this especially in how that mysterious promise about the descendant of the woman gets developed throughout the book. So remember, Genesis 3, God promised that this wounded victor would come and crush the snake and defeat evil at its source. And the author then connects this promise directly to the line of Abraham. This is a part of how God's going to bring his blessing to the nations. Now, from Abraham, this promise gets connected to Judah, the fourth son of Jacob. And this is how. In an extremely important poem in chapter 49, in aging Jacob, he's on his deathbed, he wants to bless his 12 sons. And when he comes to Judah, Jacob predicts that Judah will become the tribe of Israel's royal leaders, and that one day a king will come who will command the obedience of all the nations and fulfill God's promise to restore the garden blessing to all of the world. And then after this, Jacob dies. And later, Joseph dies too. And the growing family remains in Egypt. And so the book of Genesis ends with all of these future hopes and promises left hanging and undeveloped. And it forces you to turn the page to see how it's all going to turn out. But for now, that's the book of Genesis.
Great. So after a bunch of little episodes in the lives of the patriarchs are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Genesis 37 to 50 reads a lot more like a novella instead of these mini episodes. There is a unity of plot, a unity even of themes. I've always thought, and I still think, Genesis 37 to 50 would make an epic miniseries. Come on, Netflix. It might actually have to be somebody like HBO, though. There's quite a lot of content. The Joseph story, though, serves as a bridge between the stories of the patriarchs and the story that will be told in the second book of the Bible, Exodus. And the book of Exodus is named for the event that is its climax, the Exodus, when God saves God's people in a very dramatic fashion. But first, Joseph. First, the bridge from the patriarchs, from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to Egypt. And the Joseph story raises a lot of questions, but the one that I would like us to consider today is this. What happens when in the working out of one of God's big promises, we experience scarcity rather than abundance? I'm going to say it again. What happens when, while we're waiting for the fulfillment of one of God's promises, we experience scarcity and not abundance? Scarcity, short supply, not enough. Genesis 1 and 2 was all about abundance. God created a good and abundant world. But from Genesis 3 onwards, abundance is often pushed to the edges, and humans seem far more aware of scarcity. Sometimes real scarcity, sometimes imagined, but scarcity nonetheless. And scarcity, when we experience it, can make the promises of God seem impossible. Just like when God's promise to Abram, descendants like stars in the sky, had to withstand the scarcity of children that Abram and Sarai faced. Just like when Isaac and Abraham walked up the mountain with a scarcity of an animal for the sacrifice. Just like when Isaac's son, Jacob, was so jealous of his twin brother Esau getting the birthright that he deceived his father. Just like when Jacob's father-in-law saw a scarcity of eligible bachelors and deceived Jacob into marrying Leah, requiring a second 7-year period of work if Jacob wanted to marry his beloved Rachel. Scarcity is part of the family dynamic, going way back in this family of promise. This family, who is the beginning of the fulfillment of God's promise, is far from ideal, maybe even far from exemplary. Or maybe they're just enough like us that we can see God's goodness extending to us as well. Let's look at where the scarcity shows up in the Joseph story. There is initially a scarcity of love, of belonging, of goodwill in the family Jacob has. What happens when someone is the favorite? Now, if you look at this story, it's not just that Joseph is favored. And in that case, what is it like to be the not favored one? But it's not just Joseph. It's also Leah and Rachel. It talks about Jacob loves Rachel, right? And how would you like to be, first of all, how'd you like to be the second wife? But secondly, how would you like to be the second wife who he doesn't really love? That doesn't sound like a nice life for Leah. The other complicating factor there is that Jacob is married to not only Leah and Rachel, but their sisters. Can we pause for a moment to just think about how difficult that would be? Not just for Jacob, but maybe more for the sisters. Marriage is hard enough, but also notice that the 12 sons of Jacob and the daughter, who isn't mentioned here, but we learn about elsewhere, let's remember Dinah, those 12 sons and that one daughter are actually from 4 different mothers. Because not only does he have children with both Leah and Rachel, he also has fathered children with the slaves of Leah and Rachel, Bilhah and Zilpah. So friends, I know you might think that your family is really complicated, but I think maybe Jacob's family takes the cake. Now, not necessarily. There are probably other families that have just as complicated situations and dynamics, but we haven't even gotten to the part where the brothers sell Joseph to the slave traders, and it's already a very complicated and broken family, let's be honest. The text tells us in chapter 37, verse 3, that Jacob, who's now called Israel, loved Joseph more than any of his other kids. So it's not just that the other kids thought their dad maybe favored Joseph, it's that he really did love him more. He really did pour out his love on this kid in ways that never made it to the others. That's hard. That's scarcity. A scarcity of love and even of justice from Jacob to his kids, and a serious scarcity of any goodwill from the brothers towards Jacob. Genesis 37 verse 4 says that when the brothers saw this love that Jacob had for Joseph, they hated Joseph. And really, who can blame them? And they could not offer a kind word. Again, if you've lived in a family where someone cannot offer you a kind word, first of all, I'm sorry. but secondly, you're represented here in the pages of Scripture. So Jacob's quite imperfect parenting has some dire consequences for his family. And then there becomes the scarcity of what I would call common sense. Joseph, this golden child, 17, so, not completely grown, but not a child really anymore. He kind of comes off as arrogant if you read the story. It's almost as if his dad's outlandish affection has actually gone to his head. He has a dream about how his brothers will one day bow down to him, and he can't keep his mouth shut. Don't you just want to take him aside? Joseph, some things are just for you to ponder in your own little heart. Not everything you think or dream needs to be spoken. The second time he has such a dream, even his dear old dad says, you might just want to keep this to yourself. So love is scarce in this family, or it's oddly distributed at least. The family dynamics are built on a variety of scarcities. And a few chapters later, food becomes scarce as well. Food scarcity, something not most of us have firsthand knowledge of, mercifully, is a real thing in our world and even in the city of Kamloops. Many people around the world, and again here in Kamloops, can barely afford or maybe even cannot afford or access fresh and healthy food. And this is something that has roots in systems. When you hear of food insecurity or organizations that are working toward food security for all, this is what they're talking about: access to fresh and healthy food. But this isn't something that people always have. And in the ancient world, when there was a famine, they didn't necessarily have stores set aside, frozen, dehydrated things that they could go to the pantry and pull out cans of goods. So life goes on after Joseph's departure. His death, as far as his dad knows, but his leaving, according to the brothers, probably something that whole family knew you weren't supposed to talk about, right? It didn't come up at family dinners. Whatever happened to Joseph? But years pass and the famine comes. Food is scarce, except for in Egypt, where Joseph has risen and fallen a couple of times, had been falsely accused, thrown in jail, has been forgotten by a friend he makes, and then rises in a fairly spectacular way to prepare for a famine and then to govern over the distribution of food. And the food scarcity becomes an important plot device. It is what causes the brothers to travel to Egypt. They hear that there is food in Egypt, and they have no idea that it is their long-lost brother that is the reason that there is food there. But they set out, their survival is at stake. In the bigger story, this is what will draw the sons of Israel, the sons of Jacob, to live in Egypt, where they will eventually experience 400 years of slavery and then the Exodus. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the Joseph story, the famine is what draws the brothers to Egypt, the promise of sustenance, the survival of their family. They get a little more than they bargained for, to put it mildly. They discover their brother. Now, I think my favorite part of the story is actually when he knows it's them before they know it's him, and he has to leave the room so he can weep. Wow, I'd like to watch that in real time, right? Real family is what I see there. They do eventually realize this is their brother. This is the one who lived through what maybe he shouldn't have survived. And they fear the revenge that he might take and that they know that they deserve. But somehow Joseph seems to see abundance now, not scarcity. Not only does he have food to share, he is even willing to share himself with these who've betrayed him. So how does Joseph hold on to the promise given to his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather in the face of the roller coaster of abundance and scarcity that is his life story? What is his secret? What kept him going when he was betrayed by his brothers and was sitting in the cistern? Or when he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and landed in jail? Or after the cupbearer who he befriended in jail was restored to his place but forgot about Joseph, who remained in prison? What enabled his response when his brothers showed up and wanted food? I'm not sure. See, I could probably write a book telling you the 3 magic things that Joseph did. That if you just do these 3 things, then you'll be fine. You'll be able to forgive everybody that hurts you, and you'll live in abundance, right? You've seen these things for sale. Just do this, and it'll all be fine. But then we live in more of an actual story, like we read in the book. The story doesn't seem to be there to tell us what we should do. The story tells us what God does, what God is like, who God is. And we do hear Joseph announce that big theme. His brothers come back after Jacob has died. So they were already a little bit afraid of Joseph, but at least they had their father in common and maybe as a bit of a buffer to keep the peace. But now that their father is gone, they come, as one pastor pointed out, just shy of wearing their wheat costumes to bow down and fully realize Joseph's dream. And they bow before their powerful brother and offer themselves to be his slaves because they know they may not get anything. And this is what Joseph says. Don't be afraid. This is chapter 50. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Wow, from a family where they could find no kind word for Joseph, Joseph finishes the story by speaking kind words to them. This is not the same kid who strutted about in his special coat from Daddy and spouted the dreams he'd been having. This guy has grown. There's been some serious character development, but it's all in deleted scenes. It's all off camera. We don't actually get to see that part. But this is someone who knows who he is and who he's not. Am I in the place of God? He says. Well, if we go back to the beginning of the story, that's kind of what he was going for. I'd like to be elevated. I'd like to be someone who you all bow down to. That would be great. And let's face it, he's gotten pretty close. He sits at Pharaoh's right hand. Pharaoh, who is viewed in Egypt as the son of God. But he gets this part right, Joseph does. He knows his own story. He names what's happened to him. You, my brothers, intended evil. In other words, guys, it was not okay what you did. He's not calling what they did good. He's not saying God wanted you to do this terrible thing. He's saying you did something. It was not okay. It was evil, but God. They've harmed him. They've broken something in a family that was already broken. They've caused their father deep grief. And again, their father had also been the cause of deep grief. It's a complicated family because all families are complicated. But Joseph also seems to know and has experienced that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is a God who can take the worst of what humanity can do and somehow bring good out of it. God bringing good out of something doesn't mean that the something was good. Never mistake evil for good, but never look at something awful, something tragic, something evil, and fall for the lie that God couldn't possibly do anything with this. This is the story that began way back in Genesis 1 with the God, the Holy Spirit, hovering over the chaos of nothingness and preparing to bring life, something out of nothing. And then God did, made something, and a lot more somethings, and then someones. And then the someones rebelled. And God has been working with what we've got ever since, continuing to hover over the chaos, continuing to bring life out of nothing, and also managing to bring life even out of death, good even out of evil. Now, I don't want to give you the wrong idea here. Joseph doesn't emerge from this family of origin unscathed by the very same issues that have marked his family for generations, just as we don't escape either. But when his father, when Jacob, who is now called Israel, blesses his sons shortly before he dies, he says something about Joseph, and I think Jacob gets it right. Here's what he says in chapter 49, starting at verse 22. The old and almost ready to die Jacob says this: Joseph is a fruitful vine near a spring, whose branches climb over a wall. With bitterness, archers attacked him. They shot at him with hostility, but his bow remained steady. His strong arms stayed limber. And this is where we say, how? How did he do it? What did he do? What's the magic formula? And this is what Jacob tells us. Because of the hand of the mighty one of Jacob, because of the shepherd, the rock of Israel, because of your father's God who helps you, because of the Almighty who blesses you, with blessings of the heavens above and blessings of the deep that lies below, blessings of fruitfulness, the breast and the womb, he says. So don't miss it. Jacob, as an old man, can see few things really clearly. With the restoration of his favorite son, Joseph, even Jacob doesn't credit Joseph with his rise to power, with his ability to forgive his brothers, with the way in which he has grown and matured and in some ways outgrown his family dynamics. Jacob credits Joseph's fruitfulness and thriving, even through such difficult things, to the God whose hand is on him, to the God who shepherds, to the God who is a solid foundation, to the God who also showed such immense blessing to Abraham and Isaac and continued to bless Jacob, Israel, and Israel's children, all of whom are part of the fulfillment of God's promise to bless all the nations through this one family who will become a great nation. The end of the Joseph story is one of reconciliation, the brothers reunited. But the end of this story is also a cliffhanger, because now the children of Israel are in Egypt. In our family, this is the moment when we go, dun, 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 right? Like, it's not good news that they're in Egypt, because don't we remember, isn't there a vague recollection of Israel in Egypt? Oh, that's not a good thing. That's not a good part of the story. So if there were a soundtrack to the story of Joseph, you know how sometimes you know you're at the end because the music gets all nice and happy and resolved? It doesn't here. It maybe does for a moment, and then there's this line, there's this tension building as the story draws to a close, a tension that maybe even causes us to want to read the sequel. For after Genesis comes Exodus, and we'll pick up that story in a couple of weeks. But the question does remain, what is God's promise to us? And then what do we do when we live or encounter or experience scarcity while we're waiting for that promise to be fulfilled? Well, what is God's promise to us? Well, God makes quite a few promises, I think, but the one that's been on my mind and my heart these days is the promise that the kingdom has come, but is also coming. Every day when I pray the Lord's Prayer, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, I have to wonder, is it happening? Is earth getting more heavenish? Is my life getting any more heavenish? My neighborhood, my city, my country, my world? Are we starting to show signs of life even in our community that is Southwest Community Church? Do I see God at work bringing life from death, bringing unity among diverse people, enabling vision to be God's, enabling us to have the vision to be God's people and to demonstrate a different way of being in the world? Can we hold in tension that this is the world God created, but also the world he's promised to make new? And what do I do when that promise, which comes with the promise of wiping every tear away, undoing death once and for all, what do I do when all I see is scarcity? What do I do when I've lost sight of abundance? Does it mean I've lost sight of the promise itself? What do I do when all I can see is the brokenness, the inequality, greed, racism, poverty, and my own place of benefiting from the systems that keep other people in cycles that I've never even had to think about learning to escape? I think my only hope, your only hope, is to trust the one who makes the promise. The God of Abraham, who kept the snapshot of Abram's trust, even though Abram provided a lot of other footage. The God of Isaac, the God who provides in ways that bring laughter. The God of Jacob, the God who can even work through deceitful human beings who cheat and steal their birthright. Those who wrestle with God and refuse to let go until they are blessed. Those who forever walk with a limp because of their history, because of their family dynamics, and the reality of God being at work, even, and I would say, only in less than ideal families. So what do I do? How do I hold the promise in one hand, the scarcity I experience in another, and keep them there together? And not say, well, I'm just going to pretend I don't have any scarcity, because that's awkward. And what will people think if I have scarcity in my life? Or I've even heard people say, I can't talk about those things because I don't want other people who aren't Christians to think that Christians, suffer or experience scarcity. No, we have to learn how to hold those things together. And there will be times when we forget the promises of God and we need to remind one another and speak them again to one another. But we also have to hold space and make space for us to be able to name the scarcities that we experience. And sometimes we can do that in collective groups. We can do that all together. Other times we might need to do that one-on-one, right? In a safe and a protected space. And sometimes somewhere in the middle. But we certainly have to continue to hold these things in tension. And so this morning we've saved the breakout rooms, the prayer time, for the end. We're going to set the clock for 15 minutes, and we probably could go for longer, but we want to make sure you all get out of here. And it'll count down for 15 minutes, and then there'll be also the 60-second callback countdown that brings you back into this session just for a benediction. But I invite you to share with the folks who end up in your room some place where you are aware of scarcity this morning. And for some of you, this is no problem. You're very aware of where you see the scarcity in the world and in your own life, and you're quite willing to share it. For others of you, this might be the most terrifying thing I've ever said. And so it's okay. You don't all have to share right this minute, but here's an opportunity for you to do so. Maybe it is a scarcity in your own life. Maybe it's something in your family or in the community, whether in our church community or the city or somewhere else. Maybe it's a bigger issue, the scarcities of, I don't know, something worldwide, something cosmic. But this morning, let's invite others to join you in holding that scarcity in tension with God's promise to make all things new. I invite you to name those places where something is in short supply, be it love or belonging or connection, be it material provision or systems that give all people access to the things they need in order to flourish. Safety, protection, a chance to use their voice, space to heal, or even opportunities to help one another. So I will see you in about 15 minutes. And then I'll offer a blessing and send you on your way. Deep congratulations to Emily, who managed to say amen at the 1 second mark of the callback. Well, I wish I was in a group with each of you so that I could hear your stories and your requests. This last week, I got to have several meetings with various ones of you, and so don't be shy if that's something that would be helpful to you to have a conversation one-on-one or in a small group. Also, though, a note that I'm going on a retreat this week, starting on Thursday. So if I may not have quite as much time this week as some weeks, but if you would also pray that that would be a fruitful thing in my own life, a bit of a breath. I'm actually meeting 2 other colleagues in Vernon, and we've found a place where we can keep our distance, but also be together. And so, yeah, if you'd pray for me this week, I would appreciate that muchly. Also, a note for those of you, many of you probably know that Benita's dad, Henry, died on Tuesday night last week. And the service will be this week on Tuesday. I believe it will be streamed because, of course, there are limits on how we can show up to support them. So we'll do our best to get those details, and you can contact Carolyn, and she'll try. Thank you, Carolyn, in advance. So we'll try to have that for you. If you'd like to write a card for the Bowdlers or the Weenses, or for Elsie, Benita's mom, you can always bring those to the church, and we will make sure that we get those out to them. So now, as you go, may the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob bless you and keep you. May the God of Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel shepherd you and make you fruitful. And may the God who did not forget Hagar or Dinah or Leah bless you with the blessing of heaven above and the deep that lies below. The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with all of us. Amen.